Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today is very special afternoon time as I kind of try to play around with the new schedule here for the summer semester for everyone. And thank you so much for joining us here today. We have Ellisif Harris. She is a instructor and a licensed paralegal and mediator. So thank you so much for joining us. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about all the different things you do and give us a little introduction. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, JP, for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. And hello to everyone who's joining us, including some of your students who are here today. First I'll start off with how I got into the business. So while I was in school back in 2012, 2013, as soon as I started, I knew that I wanted to open up my own practice. So I went in with a really serious mindset into the program, and I actually ended up finding my own placement. And the gentleman that I did my placement with, while I was on placement with him, I told him I wanted to open up my own office. I did my placement in May, and in about October, November, he called me and said, I'm moving up to the fourth floor. There's going to be lots of available office space. I'll hold an office for you if you'd like. And I said, yes, that sounds great. And there was three of them, and they moved up from the second and third floor onto the fourth floor altogether. And I graduated in December of 2013. I wrote my license exam in February of 2014 and received my license March of 2014. And actually, I had signed my lease agreement for the office for March 1st, and I still hadn't received my mark back yet. So I was really, really counting on passing the exam. So it all worked out, and I ended up getting my insurance and everything by the end of March, took my first client in April, and I've been doing it ever since. And we actually, prior to COVID, just expanded our office space. So I'm down here in Windsor, and there's 12 of us, and we're all licensed paralegals in my office. Actually, one gentleman will be hopefully giving up his license soon. He'll be called to the bar. He graduated from DePaul. So we have a interesting dynamic here at my office because basically between the 12 of us, we practice in almost every area. So it's for paralegals anyway. So it's really assisted. And I always tell my students, how important networking is, because I went out and found my own placement, and from that ended up getting an office space, and I've been here ever since. So it's really, really important, when you're putting yourself out there, networking and asking the questions and letting people know what you want to do. So that's my story of how it all started. And I'm still here over 8 years later, and I'm truly passionate about the law and teaching as well too, and mentoring.
All right, so let's get started there because I mean sometimes students have that same kind of route at first, right? Is that they have to go out and find their own internship, and I know that's something that you do as well at the
Yes.
college there. So, what can you recommend in terms of looking for places and as well um, finding the right fit? I mean, in your case, obviously, it's worked for you
Yes.
over 9 years later, right? So,
Yeah.
what can you share that you tell your students there about the
Yeah.
importance of getting the right internship?
Yeah, it is really, really important. And actually, that is something I'm doing now with the college for the spring and summer internships. And I just finished doing it for the winter semester as well, too. And thankfully, I'm the one for the students who did have to find the placements. So none of my students ended up having to go out on their own. I actually just did it as on my own initiative just to ensure I had a placement. I I like to panic about things a little bit more than I probably should. So I just wanted to find it and have it done with, to know in my mind, peace of mind, that I had my placement. But finding the right fit is really important. I wasn't sure what area of law I was interested in when I was a student. I had somewhat of an idea, but being as I only had 2 semesters in before I did my placement, I wasn't really sure. And I ended up doing my placement with someone who practices solely in provincial offenses. So I find it funny that I don't practice in provincial offenses, but I learned a lot. I really did, and I still remember, even though I don't practice it, I still remember everything that he taught me with regard to provincial offenses. Um, but definitely finding the right fit personality wise can be really helpful as well too, to try and create that mentorship aspect with your placement provider. If you know what area of law you're interested in, like I tell my students all the time, for example, I'll have a student come to me that says, I'm only interested in immigration. That makes it really easy. Obviously, pairing you with someone who does immigration would be a great fit. But then there's students who are like me, I'm not really sure what I want to do. Okay, then let's try and find you a paralegal or a law firm where they have more than one area. That way you can see as much as possible to determine what areas of law you're interested in. And I just find putting yourself out there, I'll probably say it more than once while we're talking here today, is really important. Networking yourself, asking the questions. Don't be afraid. We're all here to help. Don't be afraid to reach out and just say, I'm interested in an internship. Could you tell me a little bit more about your firm? After, taking some time to look it up on their website, their Facebook, their social media, and connect with them that way. And even if you don't end up getting a placement there, it's just another person within the legal community who knows you, and you may need to, ask for an adjournment in the future or call them for a question in that area of law. So I think placement is really, really important in the program, and it's your opportunity as a student to take what you've learned throughout your program thus far and apply it. And I think it's a really big eye opener for students when they go into their placement, because a lot of the times necessarily what we're doing while we're out in the field is a little bit different than what you learn in the classroom.
So you just talked about putting yourself out there and talking about networking, and certainly in your case, the fact that there's all the different paralegals there in different areas, it's important to network even within the office space, because they may be practicing an area that someone came to you for, and you can refer something to them, and vice versa. But especially over the last couple of years, we've had limitations, let's say, on how we network, or just a change in networking. Then in the Zoom era, any advice you can share with students about how to kind of put yourself out there in light of the fact that it may be a little bit different? I mean, mindful, obviously, we're now coming back into more in-person things, so that's even a new experience after being used to being remote. But what can you share about how to put yourself out there and be effective, whether it's looking for internships, whether it's looking for part-time work, or even looking beyond in terms of setting up and putting your shingle up?
Yeah, I think in terms of all of that, I think the first step that's really important for the students is just to make that first step, to put themselves out there and say, hi, I'm a student and this is what I'm interested in, or, I have a question. Do you mind if I could give you a call? Although, and it has changed, right, in all aspects of our practice, COVID has changed many things. I actually just went to my first in-person dinner last week, and that was really, really nice. It felt nice to not be behind a computer screen. And I know for me, I'm sure as well as you, JP, that it's changed my teaching style, a lot of the ways that I do things, and I really struggled with it in the beginning. It is a lot more different, especially when I was only used to going to court in person, teaching in person, and so to be behind a screen, it's a little bit difficult. And I know a lot of my students have said, I'm too nervous to put up my hand or ask a question in the chat. But it's the connections that you make while you're in school that can assist you once you're licensed and once you're practicing, whether you choose to open up your own business or, go and work for a lawyer. That is the number one thing I push to my students all the time: networking, putting yourself out there. So for example, I had the treasurer come in as a guest speaker to my class, and I was speaking to my students ahead of time, and they all said, well, we're not really sure. Like, how do we ask a question? Is it okay? Do we turn on our camera? Do we put it in the chat box? For me, anytime that you can see the person's face and associate the name with that face, they're going to remember you. And you can follow up by email. I met you in Ellisif's tribunal class, and I was really interested about this one portion you were speaking on. Could you set aside 20 minutes to speak with me over the phone or virtually? It's just about really honestly putting yourself out there and trying your best to make those connections. And don't think, oh, well, it's just a virtual guest speaker in one of my classes. It's no big deal, because you're not only going to take away tips and tricks that they're giving you, but also you're losing out on that opportunity to network yourself and put yourself out there.
And I would certainly echo that from all the people that, I tell the students afterwards to connect with them, and they've gotten jobs as well, because there's a connection, right? It's not kind of an awkward, hey, I read about your decision on, Can Lee that you were involved with. I mean, you have more of a natural jumping off point. Either you've come to the class or we've discussed something, right? So I think, again, would echo for students that use those opportunities to build those connections, because sometimes it's not so important as what you know, as who you know. And as you can certainly attest to, that helps vouch for you when you're looking for either an internship or a job or anything in the long run there. Now, one of the other things there that you did that's interesting as well is certainly getting right into your own practice, right? I mean, you already had the lease before you had the result there, as you were mentioning. And there's also a lot of apprehension from students if that's the route that they're going into. So what can you share from that experience? If you had to go back, to 2012 and around the time they're getting ready for that leap of faith there a couple of years later, would you do it all over again? And what could you tell yourself now if you were to go back to your younger self there and say, here's what you have in store for you if to do anything differently that others going that same route can benefit from?
Yes. I definitely would do it all over again. It's brought me to where I am here today. And I would not say, it's been all sunshine and rainbows. There's been a lot of ups and downs. And COVID was quite difficult for us sole practitioners, but I definitely wouldn't change a thing. I'm very passionate about the law, but I knew going into it, actually I have family who work in the legal field. My uncle was a Court of Appeal judge, and my aunt's a lawyer and a deputy judge. My other aunt's a retired lawyer. And I just knew right from the beginning I was interested in law, and that's what I was passionate about. And so I always tell my students, you want to stick with what you're passionate about, because it'll all work out for you in the end. And so the biggest thing for me, and I'm sure this has been said multiple times before, but having a mentor, having that network of people that I could go to, because you're just grazing the surface with your education you're receiving. There's no way you can learn everything you need to know, even if you go to law school. Once you graduate and you're actually out there and you're practicing in the legal field, it's a whole nother beast. And I just think that for me, if I didn't have that support and that network, the community that I built of mentors and people I could call for advice and questions, and even just maybe reassurance sometimes, I don't think I would still be practicing, honestly. And I say that to my students all the time. Yeah, maybe I could have opened up, out of my home and it would have been cheaper, or I could have done this differently or this differently. But for me, having that, I just drafted a claim. Is there any way you can take a look and review, see if there's anything I'm missing, catch any spelling and grammar, things like that? It's just really been a great experience for me. What would I change about it? Networking more in the beginning. In school, I did a lot of it. Once I actually started, I just kind of got caught up in observing and, working on my business. I didn't go to as many events and networking groups and things like that, like I probably should have. But I was spending a lot of time getting the business up and going and all of that. Definitely one thing I could say is I'm not into the accounting portion of it. So even when I first started, before I even had my first client as well too, I hired a bookkeeper because that was one thing I knew. It's not my strong suit and I shouldn't even bother to try. But this is all tips that I found out from speaking with people who were already licensed and who were already practicing. And thankfully my mentors, told me, all right, I signed up for this. Don't waste your money. I didn't get any clients out of it. Don't do this. They were there to give me the tips and guidance along the way. So, and I also think maybe being a little less fearful about taking on new challenges as a newly licensed paralegal, just showing the client that, you are confident in your abilities and yourself, because if you do that, they're not going to question you. And I get that a lot from my students, do your clients say anything to you? You look like a younger female, things like that. I never had any problems with clients, because when they come in, if you do your due diligence, you're competent, you do your research, a little bit of research ahead of time, you're going to show them in that consultation, what you're talking about, and they should hire you. And so just projecting that confidence and your ability to do the job, because even 8+ years in, I get questions sometimes and I'm like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And that's one of the greatest things about this profession is changing every day, and you're always learning new things. So I think the biggest thing for me would be to say, find yourself at least one mentor, but the more you have, the better.
And how about, going about doing that? Especially as a sole practitioner, it's not as easy. Certainly in your situation, you have the benefit of other people around, but not everyone that has a sole practice that maybe sets up shop at home, as you were mentioning, or maybe they have their own space and there's not other paralegals or lawyers nearby. But again, is that as simple as putting yourself out there, as you said before, and look for people who are willing to mentor? Or is it joining organizations? What can you share about kind of getting the mentor or mentors that you need to help support you especially when you're starting brand new and everything is daunting and overwhelming?
Yeah. Volunteering is a great way to put yourself out there and to network. When I finished my internship, before I went back to school, I volunteered. And then also from the time I finished school until when I wrote the licensing exam, I volunteered. And then after I had passed the licensing exam, even when I became licensed, I was still shadowing. Putting yourself out there, if you work from home, or like you said, you're not really surrounded by a lot of people, that could be a little bit more daunting. Like you said, not everybody has the setup that I have, which I'm very fortunate for. But even if you're not this is what I found has been great about COVID, even if you're not in the same city, you're in Toronto and I'm down here in Windsor, email me, call me. I'll be more than happy to help anytime, not just my students, for anyone. I like to pay it back, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't receive the mentorship that I had received when I first started. And so I like to pay it back. And I know that I have watched many of your podcasts, and I know many of your guest speakers have said the same thing as well too. Take advantage of that. We're not just saying it for no reason. We really mean it. So like I said, put yourself out there. If you're going to an online networking event, if you have the chance to turn on your camera and ask a question, follow up by email. Like I said, volunteering, find out what organizations or committees are around you that you can join. I know right now I'm on the Paralegal Advisory Committee. I have been since 2015 with the college, which is a committee that works towards bettering the program each year. And through that committee, we have just discussed starting another committee as well too. And so because I'm on that committee, I will also join the other committee as well too, sort of like a paralegal task force. So one thing snowballs into another. So even just any little chance you have to get involved. And I don't know about where you are, but down here in Windsor, we're starting to do a bit more things in person. And so attending those networking events is really, really extremely important.
Now, we're talking a little bit about your practice there, and certainly you said you're not doing any provincial offenses. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you do, and what's that been like in terms of from the start to today. Has there been changes in areas, and how did you kind of get into the areas that you are in practice?
So when I was in school, funny enough, I loved landlord tenant board and I hated small claims. That was something I found out after I had completed my placement. But I knew I didn't want to do, there was a lot of things I knew I didn't want to do. So when I opened my own practice, I started with landlord tenant board and small claims. I took the advice of one of my former instructors when going into landlord tenant board to only represent landlords, because that's where more of the money is. And when you represent a tenant, then you have a conflict. You can't represent the landlord on the other side. So I went into it for that, solely for that aspect, but also because I was very interested in it. Small claims, it was something I didn't really like in school. But once I started practicing, and again, that was from shadowing people and going with them to motion court, and, going and sitting in as a newly licensed paralegal on a settlement conference or a trial, that I realized I love civil litigation. That is where my heart lies. So I'm still practicing in small claims. I find a bulk of my cases are usually regarding renovations, poor renovations. I know we can't say we specialize in anything, but if there would be something, that is a bulk of my work in small claims, is surrounding renovations, which is funny. I never pictured that, but for some reason I love it. And newly, I've been getting into human rights, and thankfully, I have the background in that. I teach tribunal practice and procedure. However, because even though I've been practicing for over 8 years, and I do have the background in it, I still I have a mentor that I'm working with who's been doing human rights longer than I have. So that's a new area for me. And since COVID and all of the changes that have occurred, I've begun to kind of stray away from landlord tenant board. It's really changed a lot since COVID, and yeah, that's something that I think I'm going to end up, eventually pushing aside, and it'll just be small claims and human rights. But those are the areas that I practice in.
So you just mentioned there about changes as a result of COVID there, in particular, the landlord and tenant board that's kind of causing you to maybe move away from it almost entirely. Maybe you can share with students what's been happening. I mean, certainly in Windsor as well. I mean, maybe different than in Toronto, but what has your experience been like with the landlord and tenant board, over the last 2 years with COVID?
Yeah, it really changed for us down here in Windsor, because we're just a small legal community. And so is the same adjudicators coming, week after week. So we got to know their style and what they liked and didn't like and all of that. And then when we switched to virtual, it was almost every hearing I've done, I've never had that adjudicator before. It's like a new experience every time. And every adjudicator has their own style. So that's one of the big things that's changed, just not having that consistency as well of going in person. For the better, there have been changes as well too. Walking in down here, we used to go to Mackenzie Hall, and walking in and getting disclosed 200 pages worth of stuff on the morning of your hearing at 9:30 when you're there for check-in, and you don't know when you're going to be called, and you're out in the lobby trying to go through all of the disclosure that you've just been provided. So switching over to virtual has helped with certain things like disclosure of evidence prior to your hearing, and things like that. But I find cross-examining witnesses to be quite difficult. I'm sure it's been mentioned before, but I've had it where there's somebody there coaching the witness, passing them papers, writing down for the witness what to say while I'm questioning them, or where I'm doing cross-examination and they're only by telephone, they don't have access to the internet, so they don't have video. It's really, really difficult when you're looking for those usual tells, that the person's maybe not telling the truth, and you can't even see who you're questioning. It's almost like you're talking to yourself. So it really takes away the effectiveness of your cross-examination, which, sometimes your whole case can hinge on that cross-examination. So that's been something quite difficult. They're getting better with organizing, the way they're calling hearings and having people log on and things like that. But I know I've been in the hearing room when there's a lot of interruptions going on. And I know probably for your students as well as mine, one of the courses I teach is a practice management course, and my students are required to do court and tribunal observations. And I know a lot of them have said, well, I saw this person was swearing at the adjudicator, or this was going on. A lot of those things did happen in person as well too, but I think it's just more prevalent now that we're online and you can see so many different, hearings, and not just ones from Windsor and things like that. So it's changed drastically too, especially with the filing and moving over to the BC system and the numbering, everything. A lot of new law coming into effect with Bill 184 and all of that. So there's been so many changes since COVID. And I know, well, it was back in maybe December, I had Doug Downey come into my class as a guest speaker, and he was saying, we're going to stay virtual no matter what, so I told my students, these are the cons, but there's also pros to it too. We have to look at, I'm down here in Windsor. Well, now if I have a client call me from Toronto, I can assist that client easily. I don't have to charge that client a special fee or my hourly rate to drive down to Toronto to do the hearing. So in that aspect, it will open up a lot of business for paralegals who are looking to practice in those areas, but also not just stay, grounded where they're at.
Yeah, and that certainly also opens up then other options for people. You can retain someone from Windsor in Toronto, so then you have to kind of look beyond your community as potential clientele that you can take on, as well as that they have other options now beyond the people that are local, regardless of where you're setting up shop. So that's certainly something that's really expanded as a result of COVID. And one of the things there with the landlord tenant board, I mean, certainly in person, was that you'd have the option the day of a hearing to go through mediation, right? And try to resolve the matter. I mean, essentially, if both parties said, yeah, we'll try it out, it goes to mediation, and then likely it doesn't end up at a hearing. How was that done virtually? I mean, is it better or worse, or is it still kind of the same options there the day of the hearing, or is it more difficult virtually, or do they have options prior to the hearing itself?
Yeah, I found it to be relatively the same, although I would say, because as I stated, I only represent landlords. So oftentimes, the tenant is afraid they can't afford representation for the most part, or, they'll speak to tenant duty counsel, but they don't have someone there. And so having that in-person connection to show the tenant, I'm not out to get you. Look, this is what we're asking for, and, make that personal connection with them, that's changed. I find for the most part, if the tenants can attend on video, that the mediations play out relatively the same. And then, like you said, it doesn't settle, we go right into hearing. They still do them on the day of, which I find maybe could be a little bit waste of time. There could be better ways to do it, maybe like schedule the mediation a week before, and then that way, if you settle everything, you're done, you don't go to hearing, and if you do, you proceed. So there could be maybe a bit more organization when it comes to that, but I find, for the most part, mediation is the same. But again, same problems when you're talking about cross-examining. If you don't have your video on, I can't see you. Are you listening? Did you put the phone down and walk away because you don't care what I'm saying? I don't even know if you're there sometimes, or, I'm asking a question, you're not responding. So were you listening to me? Then it's a bit frustrating. And it takes away from the success of the mediation when you're having to deal with things like that. It makes it very difficult. But if the person's there, they're on video, for the most part, I would say it's relatively the same.
Now let's switch over maybe to your small claims practice, and you're talking about all these renovations. Now, I don't know if you're often on the plaintiff side or the defendant side, or it's kind of a mishmash there depending on the client, but maybe you can kind of walk us through some, let's say, a typical renovations issue that comes up, if it's more of a contract issue or a tort issue, and kind of how it goes from beginning to end there in the small claims court, especially with the last couple of years where there's been kind of a pause in some areas with going forward, and how that's been on your practice.
Yeah, I know definitely down here anyways, the small claims was moving very, very slow to switch over to anything online. We just recently started receiving settlement conference dates, and they're still not fully open in person or anything like that. And when they were scheduling trials, it was mainly trials that had proceeded prior to COVID. Day one or day two of trial had already happened, and there'd been quite some delay. So I know the ones down here, there wasn't a lot going on for my students. But funny enough, when I was connecting with the Toronto Small Claims Court for my students, we were getting, 5 links a day for trials. So it actually varies, even just, even though you're not that far away in Toronto, down here in Windsor, we haven't been moving as fast when it comes to that. But so a typical renovation case for me in small claims, I'm usually, for the most part, 90% of my work in small claims, I'm for the plaintiff. However, I do love doing defense work. It's nice to be on the defense side every once in a while and feel challenged where you're on the opposite side trying to poke holes in the case rather than, setting the case. And usually for the most part, the cases that I work on, someone comes to me and, says to me, okay, I paid $45,000 for these renovations. Look at all these issues. And, first things first, okay, I'm going to tell them you need to go and get quotes. Down here in Windsor, really small community, a lot of people in the same industry don't want to give quotes on another person's work to say, this wasn't done well, because they're going to see each other when they're purchasing their materials and all of that. So I found I've had to create a lot of connections, with people who work in the construction industry, renovation industry, because I'll work on cases that are interior and exterior. So, 1 minute I'm doing driveway or cement, the next minute it's a roof, the next minute it's, renovations to your kitchen, bathroom, washroom. But at the end of the day, what's most important are those connections, because you need that quote and you need that expert witness to testify if you go to trial. So when the client comes to me, first things first, I'm going to go check it out on site myself. I'm going to take some photographs so that I know when I'm depicting it in the claim that I'm properly explaining it for the deputy judge, because I've seen it myself. So that's something that I prefer to do. Go down and look at whatever it is, the poor renovations myself. From there, I have the client get 2 to 3 quotes from someone in the same industry, so we can show the deputy judge how we came to that number. And then I lay out the claim, everything in the claim, usually, standard style. I like to use headings. And for me personally, I like to attach everything I have right at the time that I file the claim. It saves me from having to serve 14 days prior to the settlement conference, unless I don't have access to whatever that document is. Like usually expert reports, I don't have them right away, but we have the quotes. So we supply everything, pictures, quotes, receipts, all of that gets attached to the claim. Next step, we wait for the settlement conference. If we come across any additional evidence, we'll file that prior to settlement. Settlement conferences generally are okay. I noticed online versus in person, it's relatively the same. I find the deputy judges really have good control over the room, virtual or not. So they're really great at what they do. And then after the settlement conference, hopefully you'll be successful at the settlement conference stage. If you're not for your client, then that's where it becomes very costly, because trial adds up quite quickly. Never charge a flat rate for small claims, by the way, for all the students who are listening, always hourly, because something that starts off so small can end up very time consuming. My trials for renovation cases are usually between 2 and 3 days, sometimes more. Sometimes if it's a smaller case, maybe a little bit less, but for the most part, it's extensive because you at least have to have one expert witness to tell the judge, I saw the work, this is why it was wrong. This is why it's going to cost this much to fix, because it's always more when you're going in doing repairs, because then you're ripping out the other person's work and you're starting from scratch to redo it for the most part, if the renovations were done very poorly. And then, yeah, so trial's my favorite part of the job. That's what I love to do. Some people prefer, the paperwork and the legal research aspect of it. I prefer the settlement conference stage and the trial stage, because that's where I really get to do my work. I will say, thankfully, lately, I've been pretty lucky with settling out a lot of files before we even get the notice of settlement from the small claims court. So I've been really lucky in that aspect. Small claims, I find the clientele is a lot different than landlord tenant board. For the most part, they're not, they're a little bit more understanding. They're not as emotional because it's not related to, something as specific as, a tenant who's about to be evicted from their home. So I find the emotional level aspect is a lot different from small claims to landlord tenant board. And a lot of the times in small claims, they are represented on the other side too, which makes it really easy. And when they're not, I find the deputy judges down here are very clear with self-represented litigants. And, they won't accept that as an excuse for everything. Well, I didn't know because I was self-represented and all of that. So I find working in the small claims court is a lot different than the landlord tenant board, a lot more formal, a lot more black and white versus you're not working in the gray area as much. So I enjoy it.
And what about if you compare and contrast that with the other area that you just talking about, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario? How have you
Yeah.
found, again, you're looking at two distinct tribunals there. I mean, I guess part of the tribunals Ontario super
Yeah.
cluster now that the SJTO is not there, but comparing those two as well with small claims, how have you found sort of the differences there? I mean, one of the things certainly that I talk about in tribunal practice is that the tribunals are different from courts and from each other, right? That you can't just say, well, hey, I've been practicing for 8 years at the landlord tenant board. Small claims or the HRTO is going to be pretty much the same thing. So no
Oh,
need to
no.
worry, right? What can you share with us about process and procedure that's different amongst the three areas you practice in?
Yeah, you're completely right. And I tell all my students that too. I know in my textbook for the tribunals, we cover 14 different tribunals. And, I always tell my students exactly what you said. You can practice in landlord tenant board for 10 years, but switching over to another tribunal, it doesn't necessarily mean the process or procedure or anything's going to be similar. I think the tribunals are similar in the fact that they are a little bit more informal compared to the court system, like small claims. However, in my opinion, whether you're going to landlord tenant board, small claims, human rights, whatever other tribunal, Ministry of Labor, anything, you should treat it the same. Your level of professionalism should still be the same. You're preparing the same. I wear a suit whether I'm doing a hearing in landlord tenant board or a trial in small claims court. Because for me, it's just that level of professionalism and respect. But the differences between really landlord tenant board and any tribunal are really different. A landlord tenant board is almost like a beast in and of its own. And so comparing to any other tribunal, it's a lot different the way they do things. Human rights, I really, really enjoy the process of the way they handle their files from the beginning. So for example, when you file your Form 1, human rights is going to do a review and make sure, are you in the proper jurisdiction? Did you provide enough information within that Form 1? Otherwise, they could dismiss it before you even go anywhere with it. Landlord tenant board doesn't have that. They don't review applications. They accept, you get your file number, you get your hearing date. So I like that portion of it. I also find the human rights to be more, they stick to their case law. So for example, if you find a similar case, you can basically, we don't guarantee our clients anything, but you can assure your client, this is roughly what we're looking at as an award, because we found this case, it's similar. And I think that we're in the right range. Whereas, landlord tenant board, you have one adjudicator who doesn't want to hear your case law and the next who does. So it all kind of just depends. So I find human rights is a bit more formal when it comes to the process and procedure. Also, they don't, like landlord tenant board, they schedule their mediation well in advance, and they have strict rules of when you need to get your evidence in and all of that. They're really strict on adjournments, where I've had landlord tenant board cases get 3-4 adjournments on the same file where, a landlord's going without because they're a small time landlord and the tenant's not paying rent. So just basically almost everything I find differs from looking at the tribunals that I've worked with or taught versus landlord tenant board. It's completely different. Even like, for example, Ministry of Labor, how they do their mediations, where they have the two parties in the separate room and the mediator goes back between the rooms. Every tribunal I find is kind of set up a little bit differently, but they're all similar when it comes to that they're a little bit less informal than the court system. But I find human rights and WSIB to be more formal and more court-like than the rest of the tribunals.
Now, switching over from your practice as a paralegal, I know that you brought up mediation there a couple of times, that you also do work as a community mediator. So, I mean, one of the things that I brought up in my ADR course to my students is, hey, any of you can become mediators, and you're not, directly. I mean, there's certainly other responsibilities to the law study when you're putting on your mediator hat, so to speak, but you're not regulated in the same sense that you have to have a license to be a mediator. And students are often surprised about that's an option that they can pursue. Certainly getting education in there and then getting the experience will be great assets. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how that kind of came about in terms of supplementing your practice as a paralegal.
Yeah, so actually, I ended up with the opportunity through St. Clair College, and they offered to, send me to the college to do the training. And I was really excited about it because mediation is something I've been interested in since I was a student and took ADR. So I jumped on that opportunity and I finished my training in September of 2019. Unfortunately, it was a few months before COVID hit. So we didn't get a lot of the in-person. I did finish 2 mediations prior to COVID starting. But then once COVID hit, we kind of stepped back because we were also a newer organization. So it's called Community Mediation Windsor Essex, and it's run through Family Services Windsor Essex in partnership with St. Clair College. And I did my training with St. Stephen's Community House, which is out of Toronto. And I thought it was going to be really easy going in. I do this all the time. I do settlement conferences. I do mediations. I negotiate with lawyers and paralegals on the phone and self-reps. This is going to be nothing. I was wrong. Taking off my paralegal hat and putting on my mediator hat it's a difficult thing to do because the first thing it's screaming from inside of me, I want to give this person legal advice and say, look, no, you shouldn't be doing that. And this is why, but I can't because I'm not there in the capacity of a paralegal. I'm there in the capacity of a mediator. And our system is a little bit different. So our module it's community mediation. So you actually work with co-mediators. So anytime I do a mediation, I always have another mediator there with me. Thankfully, a lot of our mediators are either from the legal background, paralegals from St. Clair College, or workers from family services. Although we are looking for people to join, however, you do have to be in Windsor to take the training. The application is available, Family Services Windsor Essex. But when doing the mediations and putting on that mediator hat, it is a lot different because I want to give legal advice and I want to dissect it with my legal mind, but that's not what I'm there to do. And so taking the training and actually putting that training into play and doing mediations has really helped me grow as a person and as a paralegal, because I'm learning active listening. And I'm sure all my students will say I like to talk a lot. So listening is something I always needed to work on. And I found that really helped with my active listening skills. And like you said, you don't need to be licensed. You're not regulated. It's a little bit different than my position as a paralegal. But what's interesting about it is we do get to see many different things through the mediation. So it could be something, like a union dispute, to it could be almost like a family law dispute because it's, people talking about their children or how they want to co-parent with each other, or, just to a neighbor dispute, a dispute between roommates, friends. So I've had the opportunity to deal with a lot of different situations, and doing it virtually I found was very, very stressful for me as a mediator. And I worked through a few of those. However, I much prefer, especially with mediation, to make that initial connection and do the mediation in person.
You touched on obviously the having to resist the urge there to give the legal advice when you have the mediator hat on there. But whether you're looking at it from the lens of being a paralegal, and whether it's settlement conference or other forms of mediation at the Human Rights Tribunal or the landlord tenant board, or as a mediator, can you maybe share some tips there for students if they're looking at either advocacy before an ADR process there, or as the mediator? They have a mock mediation that they're doing next week where some of them will be mediators as well as being representatives or the client, that you can share from your experiences on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, as a mediator, like I said, for me, the most difficult aspect of it was listening. are you able to tell what that person is really looking for? Because sometimes you need to flesh through, the emotions and some of the facts to figure out what is this person really looking for. And I find most of the time in mediation, first and foremost, the person wants to be heard. Both sides want to be heard. And so you need to make that person feel like they're being heard, and sometimes you can mirror back and ask them questions and say, I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding your position. So is this correct? Is this what you said? And kind of mirror back and summarize what they said to you so that they know that you're listening to their position, and as well so that you know that you understand. Because that would be something, I didn't really think too much about going in as a paralegal, just thinking, okay, when you're doing it for a client, obviously your goal is that you get your client what your client wants. Your client is happy. Whereas in mediation, and I know many have said this, that, both sides usually leave and they're not happy if you reach an agreement because there has to be some compromise on both sides. And so that's where it differs, if I'm doing a settlement conference for a client or a mediation for landlord tenant board versus, I'm acting as a co-mediator, doing community mediation. Because when I'm doing that, it is a lot different than the legal aspect. And I really need to remind myself and watch that. Thankfully, as students, they don't have to kind of put that out of their mind in order to do the mediation because they haven't had that opportunity to, complete settlement conferences and things like that. So that should make it a little bit easier. So I think the most simple tip I can provide is active listening. Make sure you are listening. The other thing is, obviously, if there's a position that your client wants you to take during that mediation or that mock mediation, you may need to, stand firm on that position if it's something your client's not willing to waver from. Another thing I find kind of funny, just as from a legal aspect of it, is sometimes I'll ask the person, before we actually get together and do the mediation, we have to have meetings ahead of time, case management, things like that. And I'll tell what is your bottom line? And some of them, they don't know. They don't actually know what it is that they're seeking. Some of it may not even be monetary. And so be flexible. Be flexible on what you're willing to give and take on, and prepare. A lot of the times, I know it's funny, but a lot of the licensees, especially when I first started, they laugh at me like, you're preparing all that for a settlement conference? Well, it's 45 minutes and I need to make use of my time, and I want to, do the best for my client and get that outcome that I need. And so even though it's just a mediation, if you have things that you can look over, notes from when you spoke with the person that you're representing at the mediation, or, you have a scenario, dissect it and go in and kind of think of, how you want to approach the mediation, but be flexible because that might not occur and you might need to change up on the spot. And that's something that, coming from a person like me who likes to plan every little thing, you have to be flexible, and you have to realize that it may not go the way that you're expecting, and just kind of roll with the punches on what you're dealing with in the mediation. But always whoever you're speaking with, the other side, their client, be professional, be respectful. Don't smirk, don't laugh at something that they're asking for, things like that, because that can turn the mediation very, very sour quickly. So your demeanor and how you approach people, and understanding what they want, and hearing them and being respectful can really play a big part in your mediation.
And related to that, we were talking about, obviously, the mock mediations is certainly, you've been teaching there at St. Clair College for a number of years, and both in person and remote, and the challenges there of both. But in terms of getting into teaching and what that experience has been like, maybe you can share with my students, what's sort of worked, and sort of your philosophy there, and what your students are getting from the various classes you've taught over the years.
Yeah. This will be great for your students to hear, because it is funny how it ended up happening. When I was in the program, my son was only 18 months. I was working too. I was really stressed, but I said, when I'm going in, I'm going to give this program my all. And I did. And thankfully, it did not go unnoticed by the other instructors there. I ended up, when I graduated, I got the medal for student leadership, but also student leadership award. And so one of my former instructors reached out to me and said, I'm going to be leaving in 2 weeks. I would like to recommend you to take over to teach the tribunals course. Is that something that you'd be interested in? And I jumped right on it and said, yes, please. That was one of my goals, that when by the time I hit my 5-year mark as licensed, I wanted to be an instructor. And thankfully I made that goal before my 5-year mark. But yeah, so it just ended up working out really well. The coordinator and the chair remembered my accomplishments from the program, and they were happy to have me on. And I've been there ever since. And I wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't passionate about, the law, but also students and watching them succeed, because that's a really important aspect of all of this.
Perfect. So the last question here that I ask everyone, and being an instructor there, I think you're well suited there to have all these students that have come across your classes there. But any advice there for students who are looking to enter into the field, whether it's to get into practice as a proprietor, sole practitioner, or in any of the areas you practice in, or even if it's something completely different, given your role there in terms of internships and securing them. What can you share? And thanks so much for taking the time here and talking with us today afternoon.
Yes. I would say that, like I already said, networking and finding a mentor, that's really important, whether you want to work for a lawyer or whether you want to open up your own business, but also take a look at the many other opportunities that are opening up for us paralegals and how far we've come. I mean, just the other day, it's been 15 years since we've been regulated and licensed as a profession. So that's a big accomplishment. And just even over the years as an instructor, watching the number of job opportunities that have become available from when I was a student, it's astounding. At least down here. I mean, it may differ out in the GTA area, but a lot more lawyers are hiring. And I honestly find at least once a week now, I'm getting a call from a lawyer or paralegal in the community, like, send me resumes of your top students. We have a paralegal that's from Windsor who works at a Chatham as a prosecutor. Recently, there was a paralegal out of London appointed as a justice of the peace. There's some new paralegals that are adjudicating now. I mean, the opportunities are endless. Don't get it stuck in your mind that you only have two options: work for a lawyer or open up your own business. You can work for the courthouse. You can work for the government. These really excellent job opportunities that are coming up, working in-house counsel, working for a big corporation, taking in that experience whichever way you can.
Perfect. So thanks again for those words of wisdom and for talking with us and sharing all the advice that you did. I wish you all the best there with your practice as the community mediator, as well as an instructor, and everything else that you do. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. And I think going forward, hopefully I've found a couple of days a week in the afternoon and a couple of days a week again at 5 o'clock. And hopefully we can make it work so we can have more people join us in the weeks and months to come. Thanks again, everyone, and take care.
Thank you, JP. Thank you so much for having me and all of your support for the legal profession and everything you do for the legal community. It's greatly appreciated.